So we have been talking a little bit about, in the context of H-274, bill that we all are starting to know pretty well, exactly what the legislature's role is or might be in determining what gets taught in schools. So Dr. Colby is with us today representing she sits on the State Board of Education and can give us, I think, a little bit of a little more information on how that all works that might be useful as we think about what we might do to get ag and nutrition education more ensconced in public schools and independent schools. So Dr. Colby, I know you. I'm not sure that anyone else in the room does, so maybe we'll go around quickly and say hello, but I'm Representative David Durfee from Shaftesbury.
Representative Rodney Graham, Representative Williamstown, and Chelsea.
Oh, this direction. David Templeman, Brownington, Barton, and Westmore. That's Orleans 3. Thank you.
Mike Rice, I represent the Bennington-Rutland District, towns of Danby, Dorset, Landgrove, Mount Tabor, and Peru.
Representative John O'Brien, I represent Windsor, Orange 1. The Windsor town is Royalton, and the Orange town is...
I'm Esme Cole. I represent Windsor 6, which is Hartford.
I'm Heather Supernat. I represent Windsor 4, which are the towns of Barnard, Pomfret, and Bridgewater.
I think that's it.
Great. Well, I'm Tammy Colby. For the record, Tammy Colby, I'm the vice chair of the State Board of Education. I think what I might do today is I'm also hailing from Warren, Vermont, currently, but spend a lot of my time over in Tunbridge. So a lot in Chelsea. My daughter has a horse, an Icelandic horse over in that area. So we spend a lot of time. So I know lots of the places I just heard very well. My understanding in talking with Representative Durfee is that it might be helpful to have a little bit of context about sort of what the state board role is in terms of providing structure around curricular and instructional content, but also some of the other policy levers that you as a committee might consider if you are moving forward with the bill that you have right before you right now, because there may be some other opportunities out there for you as well to think about. So I pulled together some quick slides. I thought maybe I could talk through those real quick, and then I can take the slides off the screen, and we can have a conversation again, try to answer whatever questions you have. Does that sound like a good program for everyone?
Sounds good.
Okay. What I will notice is the minute I start sharing my screen and go to slides, I can't see any of you, which means if you have a question, I just need you to speak up. Okay. I won't see a hand or anything along those lines. So let me just share my screen real quick.
She's done this before.
Oh, I have. I have. So, all right, let me just start from the beginning. So my understanding is that the question on the table is sort of how the legislature might go about establishing content standards for nutrition education, and what the role of the Vermont State Board of Education might be in the process. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Vermont State Board of Education's role in regulating curriculum instruction. So we have the authority to make legally binding rules to assist in the interpretation, implementation, and enforcement of Vermont's education statute. And that's really important as a starting point because we don't make policy, you do. And so our job as a regulatory, in this capacity, as a regulatory board, is to develop the rules that implement statute. We have to stay within our statutory guidelines that are established by the legislature. So there are two key rules that we currently own that impact curriculum instruction. One is what we call Rule Series 2000, the Education Quality Standards. They apply to public schools, with the exception being they apply to independent schools who are approved for public tuition if they so choose to opt in. Then we have Rule Series 2200 that applies that's titled the Independent School Program Approval. This applies to both approved and recognized independent schools, and there are curricular requirements in there as well. So I understand there's been some conversation around Vermont's education quality standards. I thought maybe I'd highlight a couple key points for you. That the EQS the point of the EQS is to establish standards that ensure quality standards that ensure that all Vermont students are afforded equal educational opportunities. And although quality standards is in the title, really what the quality standards are about are making sure that we have a level playing field across the state so that all students have access to challenging curricula and that they're able to achieve and exceed, quote unquote, the standards which are approved by the state board. So we have standards in the title of EQS, but actually the standards are not in EQS. The EQS is really about the quality metrics and other kinds of process things that are intended to ensure equal educational opportunities. As I mentioned before, the EQS applies to public schools and independent schools approved for public tuition that opt in to comply. And the current status on the rule is that the rule is currently under revision. And so there's been an EQS subcommittee of the state board. I'm the co-chair of that, along with Kim Gleason. And we've been working as a committee on updates to the rule, to the EQS since May of 2022, primarily with respect to implementing requirements and recommendations that have come from the requirements of Act 1 of 2019 and recommendations made by the Act 1 working group. We anticipate, this is all sort of behind the scenes, we've been doing a lot of work on the rule, but we anticipate formally opening the rule through filing with ICAR in June 2023. And that's when the rule will be formally open. So the rule is under revision and we'll begin the formal revision process here very shortly. In the EQS, section 2120.5, which is our curriculum content section of the rule, does require schools to engage in this annual process of making sure that they have comprehensive learning opportunities that allow all students to demonstrate proficiency in physical and health education. And the requirements there are dictated by 16 VSA 131. And you'll see down here, this is the language that stipulates a requirement. Right now, you'll see that it's elementary and secondary health and physical education learning experiences. And the only specificity there is with regard to education around substances, tobacco, alcohol, and drugs. There's no specific requirement for nutrition education or food systems education in that provision. The State Board of Education, as I mentioned before, we have the EQS, which is part of our rules, but under 164.9, which is the section of this statute that provides the roles and responsibilities, the duties and powers of the State Board, the State Board has broad authority to continually update standards for student performance in appropriate content areas and at appropriate intervals for grades K through 12. And so we have a litany of standards, some the Common Core, NGSS, Next Generation Science Standards. We currently have 2 standards that the board has approved that are related to health and nutrition, the Shape America Physical Education Standards and the National Health Education Standards. Those are both standards that have been adopted by the board. Adopting standards by the board is different than the EQS. So the board can adopt standards, and we also maintain a rule around education quality. There's a third thing that's floating out there in statute, and that's 16 VSA 906, which describes a minimum course of study. And the minimum course of study includes physical education and comprehensive education and health education, including the effects of tobacco, alcohol, drinks, and drugs. It mirrors the other language. Statute dictates the minimum course of study, and there's no formal rule for the State Board of Education or rulemaking related to this section of statute. So what that means is you as legislatures could update this statute and update the minimum course of study, but that would not involve a rule by the State Board. So I think, as I understand your conversation so far, I think what I'd like to suggest is there are three options for your consideration if you wanted to would like to promulgate some standards around nutrition education or food systems education. You could do that through the education quality standards. It would apply to public and independent schools approved for public tuition. It would involve regulation, right, where we would need to update the EQS, and that would involve the state board. You have the standards for student performance and content areas. This is under VSA 164. To whom it applies, it is at the state board's discretion, but it can include public and independent schools. Those are content standards, not rules, but the state board is responsible for establishing those standards. And then you have the minimum courses study, which is 16 VSA 906. This applies to public schools, approved and recognized independent schools, and home study programs. It's in statute, and it does not involve the state board. So let me just stop there. I hope that's helpful. That's sort of what I think the guardrails are for you in terms of thinking about how you might go forward.
Great. Yes. Nicely framed. I see no hands at the moment. Yeah, I do see a hand. Representative Templeman.
Ms. Colby. So we've been receiving.
Tammy, please. It's Friday. We're beyond that.
Okay. Just your involvement in education makes me want to do the prefix miss. But Tammy, so we've been taking, we took testimony from a teacher who created her own curriculum, I believe in the town of Woodstock. I forget her name. Maybe somebody can. Janice, yeah. And then I went out on my own to find another person who did exactly the same thing, and I brought them together. We also heard testimony from a very, it's almost like a juxtaposition, right? Like over here are the people who created their own, and then over here there's your colleagues who we took testimony from. I kind of got the impression they didn't want us to touch their program. They didn't want us to touch any of this. And I'm trying to find like a middle ground between these two worlds. Can you suggest a way to find that?
Well, I think so. Curricular standards do not necessarily tell teachers how to teach, right? The curricular standards provide the framework, right, for what should be taught. It can talk a little bit about how, but usually it's what should be taught. And so standards, such as those that the state board might adopt under 164, would offer a framework for what content should be offered to students and potentially what benchmarks for proficiency in that content would exist. What would that do to a teacher in Woodstock? It would say, well, this is what you should teach at a minimum. It does not preclude a teacher from teaching other things or going above and beyond that, right? So in an area so the good thing about standards is it does exactly that. It standardizes, right? At least a floor in terms of the kinds of content we expect all students to receive. And so by having a framework, you would expect that whether you were in Woodstock or you went to Hunt Middle School in Burlington or Warren Elementary School, all students would get a certain sort of checklist of content. And if you put proficiency standards with that, they would demonstrate certain levels of proficiency. But that doesn't mean that teachers don't have instructional license, right, to be able to develop their own curricula around those things. Now, you can take another step forward from just basic standards and you can prescribe sort of more instructional practice. We see some of that in Common Core, a little bit in Next Generation. You could do that too. You need not. And so I think if you're trying to think about not stifling the creativity of great teachers, and we have lots of great teachers in this state, right? And then you might think about creating a framework and saying these are the requirements. We want to make sure all students learn or know these things and are able to know and do certain things. But have that in terms of your creative license, right? In terms of your instructional practice, that might be a middle ground. But what that means is that even though you have common content standards, you have to recognize that how students learn that content may look very different across the state. Right? So oftentimes, and what the state board has done in Vermont is, we've leaned on national standards, right? And so these are curricular standards which have been vetted nationally, again, Common Core, things along those lines, and use those as frameworks. And they come with technical assistance for teachers. They come even sometimes with instructional resources, which is great for some teachers, but other teachers don't like to have that sort of level of structure, or I guess, or level of, they like more autonomy in developing their curriculum. So is that helpful?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Representative O'Brien.
Tammy, just to use an example that might help me, could you tell us about how, say, sex ed is taught in schools? Because it's not, as far as I know, it's not a rule, right? It's not a standard you meet proficiency for, and it's not in statute that we have to teach this. So where does that fit? It sort of fits under health and nutrition or the SHAPE standards, right?
Yeah,
it's
that's
really
right.
At an SU level, they can do it or they don't have to, or teachers can be creative about it, or they can never mention it.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the health standards, but I do believe that our health standards have some basic requirements around that. However, there is some flexibility within SUs to make decisions around instructional practice.
You all set, John?
Yeah, I mean, I don't quite understand that. So in some middle schools or high schools, it's not even mentioned, or it has to be?
I believe it has to be. As I said, I'm not an expert in those standards. So I can go look, but I believe that there are some minimum requirements around the health standards, right? In what students should be taught. Similarly with other controversial topics like evolution, right? Those are not included in the Common Core, but they are included in Next Generation in some ways, right? But certainly public schools have some latitude with how they approach that topic, right? Really, I always think of standards as these are the minimum things that students should be able to know and do, right? And so that doesn't preclude SUs, SDs in Vermont from doing more. But that would have to be something that was approved by a local school board.
So how would we get to that point where agriculture has to be a minimum?
Well, so that was sort of the table 3, right? Which the table that I put in there with the 3 options, right? So I think what you could do, I think if you want standards, then you have to think about, then you either need to come in under the standards of performance and ask the state board to create standards, right? Or you can identify national standards that you would like the state board to adopt. And the nice thing about adopting national standards is that it doesn't require the board or other Vermonters to have to create those standards, right? Because that's a labor-intensive exercise to do that. So if standards are what is important, then that really is a question of coming under VSA 164 and asking the board to adopt standards in a certain area. And that could involve, again, asking the state board to develop some or work with the agency to develop some, or it would involve directing the board to adopt a national set of standards, right? If you also could make agriculture or nutrition education or whatever it is that you're sort of trying to think about, you could make that part of the minimum course of study, right, under VSA 906. If you did that, that would also apply to home study students, right? If you come in under the standards, then I think it will be important for you to be clear about whether and to what extent you would want those standards to apply equally and universally to public schools and independent schools in Vermont, right? Because that's another dimension we have to take into account. So if you want standards, that's really sort of where sort of statutorily I think your home is. If you also want to make sure that there are certain quality metrics or that those standards are implemented, for example, in personalized learning plans or something along those lines, right? These other sort of instructional practice kinds of things, then you can also insert into the EQS other kinds of process requirements, right? About how they're taught and what the quality, what the metrics of quality in curriculum instruction would look like with respect to implementing those standards. So the standards are here, but the metrics and sort of the quality metrics and sort of the guardrails for how they're implemented and you know the kinds of markers of good instruction that we would expect around a set of standards, those would be in the EQS.
Representative Templeman?
So to go back to the example of sex ed, which I believe falls under tell me at any point if my terminology is wrong here, but the framework of health.
I believe so, that they're in the SHAPE health standards, yeah.
Okay, so a school union can choose which teacher teaches health. Like, for example, the PE teacher may be, teaching health in this school, but a science teacher may be teaching health in another school. Is that correct?
That's right. That there isn't there right. Although under the teacher licensure provisions, right, when we license teachers to teach certain topics, that's where, that also comes into play. But that's not a state board. That's not in the state teacher licensure, and sort of what the qualifications are for teachers to teach certain classes is not under the purview of the state board. That's an agency.
A state agency.
The Agency of Education.
Okay.
And I misspoke. It's the National Health Education Standards, by the way.
It's federal, not state.
I'm
sorry. So you said national. So that means
it's national, but they're not federal, right? These are not standards promulgated by the federal government. They are promulgated by the Society of Health and Physical Educators for SHAPE. And who does the National Health Standards? National Health Standards are CDC.
Okay.
So there are standards developed by the CDC for states to consider adopting.
For health education in this case.
Yeah.
The Common Core is a different group that developed those. Now, Next Generation Science Standards is a different group that developed those, right? There are lots of standards out there, right? And so we can pick and choose as a state which standards we put in force. And we need not adopt standards that have been developed by some other organization. We can develop our own standards. By practice, in Vermont, we have tended to adopt national standards. I think that's probably because those standards have been vetted, right? They're usually well developed, and they're maintained by an outside organization. And that it allows us to have some consistency across, nationally, benchmarks and things along those lines. But it also takes some of the administrative burden off the state to continue to develop them and then to continue to update and maintain them.
Tammy, I wondered if it would be helpful to just talk a little bit more about the current, the upcoming opening of the rule.
Sure.
For EQS, just to help us think about what it actually means. So, and looking at the grid on your last slide of the three different options, that falls into. So if the legislature wanted to, if legislature passed this bill, or passed a bill, wanted to do something, one approach would be to take the first section of the grid there, the top section. Is that what's happening with Act 1 of 2019?
That's correct, right? And so EQS currently, right now, is under review by a committee of the state board. It's not formally opened until we submit it to ICAR, but we've spent the last year carefully considering input from the Act 1 working group, as well as a broad range of stakeholders in the field. We've received some suggestions for technical corrections from AOE to bring the rule into alignment with current policy and practice, right? Since it hasn't been open since 2013. And so actually yesterday we had a full board meeting where the committee presented to the full board sort of its recommendations for changes to that. And so over the next 2 or 3 weeks, the board's going to be considering the recommendations made by that committee. And I'm anticipating that the board then on in our May meeting will have its first vote as to whether or not to accept the committee's recommendations for changes. If it is voted out, if it's ratified, then that version will start the process. We'll use that version in the filing process and ideally file for the June ICAR meeting. And then the rule will formally be open. And when it formally opens, that's when we have our formal public, although we've been taking public comment and it's not the formal public comment process that we have when a rule is open. But once the rule is open, it's open for we have an 8-month clock to get all the work done to it. And that involves ICAR and LCAR.
So noting that this dates back to 2019, I remember our first year when it was Act 1, and it's now 4 years later. If the legislature were to say, all right, we want to make some changes either related to agriculture or civics, financial literacy. There are several bills that look a lot like the bill that we're taking up, but cover a different topic.
That's right.
Could we anticipate that if the legislature agreed that, yes, we want to do one or the other of these, that it would be 4 years from now that the rule would actually be reopened? It would take that long for something to happen?
No, I don't think so. I think we have, so the Act 1 process had a working group that was charged with making recommendations to the state board by a certain date. And so they were given a period of time to do their work. We received their comments last year, and it's almost been 1 year. So based on those comments, we've been working on updating the rule for the past year. That's pretty typical. Like when the rule was open per Act 173 in the 2200 series, it's usually a year or so of work to move it through the process. The goal of the state board is before we file to try to do as much of the good work as we can and get stakeholder input and really try to put a document through the formal rulemaking process through ICAR that we consider is pretty close to being final. It's harder to take public comment and take in public comment and make changes to the rule once we enter that phase. We have a lot more flexibility to engage with the public pre-filing, and so we like to make sure that we do that. There certainly is a public comment period that's embedded in the formal rulemaking process, but historically, I think the state board sees itself as sort of the public and public education in the state, and we work really hard to make sure that we bring diverse groups of stakeholders and voices to the process.
Representative O'Brien.
But the Act 1 has been a longer process because the Act 1 working group had an 18 to 24 month clock to do their work first before it came to us.
Good. Yeah, thank you for that explanation. John?
Tammy, this is sort of more our world here. How is it possible on standards if, say, we were using the CDC SHAPE standard now, but there was another nationally professionally vetted standard that other states use? Could we, swap that? What's the process for swapping?
Sure. I mean, the state board adopts standards. And so, and our charge under 164, reaching for my green book slowly here, it says that we are supposed to implement and continually update the standards. And so, the state board keeps an eye on those. And if we feel, or if the legislature directs us to, or we're receiving public input that a certain set of standards are out of step or should be updated or reviewed, then that can happen at any time, right? It's under our general powers and duties that we are supposed to implement and continually update those standards. I don't know. I mean, this would really be up to your committee and the legislature to determine. You could say state board adopt standards X. You could also say the state board should adopt standards related to X and charge a state board with going out and seeing, like, are there national standards on this, right? And having and you could stipulate the process around, like, how do you want a committee to work on that? You know, like the Act One working group, you know, like you could have a working group that goes out and figures out, like, here are the options for the standards and make a recommendation to the state board. You could do that. I don't know firsthand about standards around agriculture. I don't know if there are national set of standards around those. You know, that would be something you might want to look into. If the state board needs to develop its own standards, then that's a process, right? You know, right? And I think the legislature would want that to be a thoughtful process. So you probably would want to constitute a working group around that. If in fact no existing national standards exist that you were interested in adopting.
And then once you adopt those standards, like the CPC one, is there a way to amend them? So it's like we like everything in it, but we just want to add Article 11 about agriculture education.
Yes, if you only wanted to adopt, you know, section, you know, 4.2 about about purple hair and this, yes, you could, the state board could do that, yes.
And Tammy, can you just remind us proficiencies? So we talked about curriculum, we talked about standards, and there's also graduation proficiencies. So
That's
when
right.
we were thinking about how might we actually affect some change, one suggestion was it could be, you know, hypothetically anyway, a requirement that before you graduate, you need to demonstrate proficiency somehow in agriculture. Who determines those? Does the state board have a role?
That's in the EQS.
It's in, okay.
The graduation requirements are in the EQS.
And those graduation requirements include proficiencies.
Yes, I'm pulling it up right now. It's not so much it includes proficiencies, but you can set at section 2120.7 establishes graduation requirements. And so you could put something in there. Remember that locals under 2120.8, you can also have you can have sort of global graduation requirements, but you can also have local graduation requirements. Right now, graduation requirements are defined in terms of students with a disability, excuse me. Right. A student meets requirements for graduation when a student demonstrates evidence of proficiency in the curriculum content outlined in 2120.5. And the curriculum content under 2120.5 is broadly defined as literacy, mathematical context, scientific practices, global citizenship, the physical education and health education, artistic expression, transferable skills. So you could, under 2120.5, insert a new section. You know what? Would it be helpful if I showed you the rule?
I think we've got it.
Believe me, it's on my computer. I won't even tell you why it's on my computer. I've been living and breathing EQS recently, but you can see under 2120.5, and these red lights and strikeouts, by the way, are the recommendations that are coming out of the committee. So they are, anything that's underlined or struck out is draft. But you can see under curriculum content, right? Each SU SD shall ensure the written delivered curriculum within their SU is aligned with the standards. Okay, so we have to have the standards in order to have something in EQS, right? And you can see that each school shall enable students to engage, and you see literacy, mathematical content and practices, scientific practices, global citizenship, and then you have your P in health here, artistic expression, and transferable skills. So you could add a new section H here that says agriculture. But if you did that, remember that this tells SUSDs what they have to do and that they have to, right, ensure written and delivered curriculum that align with the standards approved by the state board. So if you wanted something here in the EQS, you got to make sure that you have standards around that so that there's alignment between the EQS and the standards. Is that helpful?
Yeah, and when you say we could, what we were just looking at were the state board's standards.
Those are the rules. What you just looked at are the rules. That's the EQS. Remember, the standards are that list of things, right? And so the standards that we have right now are, related to sort of health and nutrition and physical education. Like we have those national standards. We would need standards around agriculture that the EQS then implemented.
Right. And I guess the thing that I'm not quite clear on is in practice, when you say, well, we could add a G or an H, whatever the last letter was there, the legislature could direct through new statute.
That's right.
That the
you would
board-
need to put in statute that there should be standards for agriculture and standards, and that the EQS and that the rulemaking for those standards it belongs in the EQS. But just know that when you do that will only apply to public schools and independent schools who are approved for public tuition. The EQS will. If you want the standards to apply universally to public schools and independent schools, and even home study programs, then you have to be specific about the fact that you want standards that apply to all three. And then the rule that under sort of the current rulemaking, the rules that would implement those standards for independent schools would be over in the 2200 series, not in the EQS, because the EQS does not, by virtue of section 165, only applies to public schools. That was a lot. Did that make sense? So think of it this way. You have to have standards, right? You got to have standards. And then if you want the standards to apply to public schools, then you need, right? So you need to establish statute, thou shalt have standards. And you can specify the standards that you want to have, or you can say AOE and state board go find standards through or how you have a committee develop standards, but you got to have standards. Then if you want them to be sort of part of the EQS and the quality assurance process that we have for SUSDs, then it needs to be in the Rule 2000, which is EQS, for public schools, and it would go under that section. And you would need to say in statute, state board, make sure that you have rulemaking. You need to give the state board rulemaking authority that says, go and put these in the EQS for public schools. If you want them for independent schools, you need to say, go and put those in the 2200 series for independent schools. But you got to have standards, and you got to have, right? And then the rulemaking, depending on to whom you want them to apply, would happen in one of those two sets of rules. State board adopts the standards. State board is involved in the rulemaking, but you have to do both. Or the third option is you just make it a minimum course of study, and you legislate it that way, but that leaves it open for interpretation by individual school districts to determine what that looks like.
Yeah.
Right? That's why I gave you the three options. You really have three lanes here to operate in. This
Representative O'Brien, and then maybe we'll wrap it up for the day.
Just out of curiosity, with what you said earlier, has Vermont developed any of the standards in-house, essentially?
Yeah. So the Act One working group is developing social equity standards right now. And because they don't really exist. And I think the Act One directed them to do so and propose them to the state board. Those new standards are going to come to the state board for our consideration. My understanding is in June, right? And the state board is under no obligation to adopt exactly what they recommend to us. So we'll be looking at those, but Yes.
But that's the first time it will be done?
I don't know that it's certainly the first time in my tenure on the board. I don't have a long history, so I don't know that it hasn't been done previously. The standards that we have right now in all the other areas are national standards.
Tammy, thank you.
No problem. Happy to answer more questions. Hopeful that was helpful to everyone.
Well, if you are asked to present to the actual education committee, you'll have a set of slides ready to go, so.
Happy to talk to them as well. So
Okay,
nice to see everyone.
Take
Take care.
care.
Have a great afternoon. Enjoy this weather.
Tammy,
Excuse me?
is your daughter at Seagram's?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we're pretty much neighbors, yeah.
Well, I'll see you tonight.
All right.
She'll be there all weekend. She rides a black horse. His name is Otar. You'll see her around. Long blonde hair. But yeah, Seagram's. And then for those of you in Chelsea, there's also Jana Meyer, who's over there as well, if you know Jana. So yeah, excellent. Thank you all. Again, always a pleasure.
have a great
Take care.
weekend.
Bye-bye.